Jesus and the apostles are forced to flee from Capernaum. And so the 22nd of May arrived, the day Jesus was forced to flee. Before dawn, one of David's messengers came hurriedly from Tiberias with the news that Herod had granted permission to arrest Jesus. Quickly, all the apostles and disciples were called for an emergency meeting, including the women. One of the female deacons was staying at the house of Judas, Jesus' brother. She was woken early with the message to go quickly to Zebedee's house. Judas received this message at the door, thinking something serious must have happened to his brother. Judas quickly gathered all the other family members living in Capernaum. His mother Mary, 2 brothers James and Joseph, and his sister Ruth rushed to his house. Meanwhile, most of the disciples had arrived at Zebedee's house. Jesus took charge, and when the evangelists had gathered around him, he gave his farewell instructions. He stood calmly in their midst and told them that not all of them could go on the flight. He knew that they too would soon be driven out of Capernaum. He told them to seek God's guidance and continue the work for the kingdom, regardless of the consequences. The evangelists were to continue their work according to their best judgment until they could be called together again. Jesus pointed to David Zebedee and said that he would be the contact person. His courier service would connect the faithful. He chose 12 evangelists to flee with him and the apostles. He instructed the 12 women to stay around Zebedee's house until he gave them further instructions at a later time. Jesus personally said goodbye to David Zebedee, both men realizing how important the courier service was to continue Jesus' mission. David assured Jesus of his loyalty at this emotional moment, saying, "Nothing that could happen to me will disrupt this service, for I have a man who can replace me. Yes, there is even a third. I am not a teacher nor a preacher, but my heart tells me to do this, and no one can stop me." Around 7:30, Jesus began his farewell speech to nearly 100 believers who had all crowded inside. Jesus appeared confident. He was in control, like the people used to know him. The seriousness of the last few weeks was gone, and he inspired them with his words of faith, trust, hope, and courage. Around 8 o'clock, 5 members of Jesus' earthly family arrived. Of Jesus' entire earthly family, only Ruth continued to believe wholeheartedly in the divinity of his mission on earth. Judas and James had retained much of their faith in Jesus but were disappointed when Jesus did not include them in the group of apostles. Since then, their relationship had cooled. His mother Mary had lived in conflict for years, between love and fear, between motherly love and family pride. She mostly doubted, although she had never forgotten the visit of the angel Gabriel before his birth. The Pharisees had visited her with questions about Jesus, and they had tried to convince her that Jesus was out of his mind. They told her that his spirituality had turned into madness. They urged her to use her influence to stop Jesus from teaching in public. They assured Mary that Jesus' health would soon collapse and that his lofty message would ultimately only bring disgrace and shame to the entire family. On the way to Zebedee's house, they discussed these matters among themselves, unaware of the impending arrest. They agreed to try to persuade Jesus to come home with them, for, as Mary said, "I know I would have influence over my son if he came home and listened to me." James and Judas had heard rumors about the Sanhedrin's plans to arrest Jesus but did not know that this plan was already in action. As long as Jesus was popular with the people, his family let things run their course. But now that the people of Capernaum and the leaders of Jerusalem had suddenly turned against him, the family's honor was at stake. They expected to find Jesus, take him aside, and urgently request him to come home with them. When they arrived at Zebedee's house, Jesus was in the middle of his farewell speech. They tried to enter the house, but it was packed. Finally, they passed a message from the back porch from one person to another until it was whispered to Simon Peter, who interrupted Jesus' speech to say, "Master, your mother and your brothers are outside and very eager to speak with you." His family expected Jesus to stop speaking and come to them. But they could not understand that he was occupied with the work for his heavenly Father. And so it happens that his mother Mary and his brothers felt deeply hurt when he did not rush outside to greet them but continued his farewell speech. They heard his resonant voice say loudly, "Tell my mother and my brothers not to worry about me. The Father who sent me into the world will not forsake me. Nor will any harm come to my family. Tell them to take courage and put their trust in the Father of the kingdom. But who is my mother and who are my brothers?" Stretching out his hands to all his disciples gathered in the room, he said, "Behold my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven, that person is my mother, or my brother, or my sister." When Mary heard these words, she fainted in the arms of her son Judas. They carried her into the garden to revive her. Jesus finished his farewell speech. He intended to go out afterward to greet his family, but a courier rushed in with the news that the officers of the Sanhedrin were close by, on their way to arrest Jesus. Jesus planned to see his family before he left, but he did not want to stop in the middle of his speech, with the risk of a public affair. This would be the first meeting after such a long separation. He intended to finish his speech and then have a private conversation with them in one of the rooms of the house, but this plan was thwarted by the circumstances that immediately followed. Through the back entrance, a group of men noisily entered the garden, causing panic around Jesus, as people thought these newcomers were coming to arrest him. The apostles grabbed Jesus and ran through the front door to the waiting boat. This explains why Jesus could not meet his family, who were waiting for him on the back porch. Just before the boat departed, Jesus told David Zebedee, "Tell my mother and my brothers that I appreciate their coming and intended to meet them. Urge them not to be offended by me, but rather to seek God's will." So it happened on Sunday morning, the 22nd of May, that Jesus, with his 12 apostles and 12 chosen evangelists, hurriedly fled from the officers of the Sanhedrin, who were on their way to arrest him by the authority of Herod Antipas and bring him to Jerusalem to stand trial on charges of blasphemy and other violations of the holy laws of the Jews. It was nearly 8:30 when this group of 25 men rowed across the Sea of Galilee on that sad morning. The master's boat was followed by a smaller vessel carrying 6 of David's couriers, who were instructed to stay in contact with Jesus and his companions. Jesus would never again take up residence in Zebedee's house. From now on, for the rest of his earthly life, Jesus truly had no place to lay his head. He no longer had anything that could even remotely be called a permanent residence. They rowed across to the other side and began the wanderings of this eventful final year of Jesus' life on earth. His followers stayed around Zebedee's house for some time and watched the 2 boats heading toward the eastern shore. The boats were mere specks on the horizon when the officers from Jerusalem arrived and began searching for Jesus. They refused to believe he had escaped and continued searching for him around Capernaum for a full week. Jesus' family returned home in confusion. They only regained their peace of mind when Ruth heard from David Zebedee that her father-brother was safe and well on his way to the coast of Phoenicia.